I had been planning the hike for weeks. The weather report said it would be clear skies for 3 days, and the late summer air was supposed to stay warm during the day and cool at night. I packed carefully, trying not to overload my pack, but also making sure I had enough supplies to last. I had my tent, sleeping bag, stove, food, plenty of water, and a filter in case I ran short. I checked my boots twice, tied my laces the way I always did, and set out early in the morning. The trail I picked wasn't one of the busiest. It was a section of a long route that cut through hills, dense forests, and stretches of open rock. I knew it wasn't going to be easy, but I wanted the quiet. I wanted to push myself. The first day went smoothly. I walked along the narrow dirt path, feeling the sweat soak into my shirt, but enjoying the rhythm of my steps. The trees gave shade most of the way, and every so often I stopped to drink and rest. By the time the sun lowered, I had found a small clearing just off the trail. I set up my tent, ate a simple meal, and watched the light fade through the branches. The woods were quiet except for the chirping of insects. That night I slept soundly. The next day I woke up sore but eager to move on. I packed quickly and pushed deeper into the trail. The path grew steeper and rockier. Roots twisted out of the ground, and I had to watch each step to avoid stumbling. Around noon I reached a ridge that gave me a wide view of the valleys below. The land stretched out in layers of green and gray, with patches of mist trapped in the low spots. I stood there a long time, enjoying the view before moving on. It was later that day when things started to feel different. I was making my way along a section where the trail narrowed, squeezed between a steep slope on the right and a sharp drop on the left. The drop wasn't sheer, but it was steep enough that a fall would send someone tumbling a long way down. The ground was dry and loose, and I kept my steps careful. At one point, I stopped and took out some water. As I put the bottle back, I noticed something strange in the dirt. It was a footprint, not just one, several. At first, I thought nothing of it. Plenty of hikers came through, even on trails like this. But when I crouched down, I realized the prints didn't look like the heavy boot marks I was used to seeing. They were lighter, sharper, and closer together. The stride was short, and the edges of the prints were fresh, not yet softened by wind or fallen needles. Someone had passed by not long before me. I kept walking. A while later, I noticed more signs. A broken branch, a piece of torn fabric caught on a bush. It was dark blue, maybe from a jacket. I bent down and picked it up, but it was just a scrap. The trail grew harder as the day dragged on. Clouds began to gather, dimming the light. My legs were burning, and I was running low on water. I wanted to make camp, but the ground along the stretch was too sloped. I pressed on, hoping to find a flat spot. That was when I smelled smoke. It was faint, drifting on the shifting air, but unmistakable. Someone had a fire nearby. I slowed down. The woods around me were silent, heavy with still air. I strained to hear, but all I caught was the rustle of branches high above. I turned my head in every direction, but I saw no glow, no rising column of smoke. Still, the smell lingered. By the time I finally found a small, flat space suitable for my tent, it was nearly dark. I dropped my pack and worked quickly, setting up shelter before the last light slipped away. I boiled water for dinner, ate slowly, and sat listening. The forest at night was different. The sounds carried farther, and every snap of a twig made me alert. I heard something moving once, not far away. It was soft, like footsteps pressing into leaves. I froze, spoon halfway to my mouth. The sound faded, and I sat still, my heart pounding. Eventually, I crawled into my tent and lay awake longer than I wanted. I drifted in and out of sleep, waking at every unfamiliar sound. In the early morning, before dawn, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, steady, not hurried, passing by. I held my breath and stayed still. The sound moved from one side of my tent to the other, then faded into the woods. I waited a long time before unzipping the tent flap. The pale gray light of morning spilled in. There were prints in the dirt, not boots, bare feet. I stared at them for a long time. They circled near the tent, then wandered off into the trees. The prints were clear, toes pressed into the soft ground, the heels deeper than the rest. Whoever it was had come close. Too close. I packed quickly and started hiking again, moving faster than usual. My shoulders ached under the weight of my pack. But I didn't stop. I wanted distance. The trail climbed higher into rocky terrain. The trees grew thinner, replaced by scrub and boulders. I looked behind me more often than forward. The feeling of being watched never left. At one point, I paused to catch my breath and saw movement in the distance. A figure. It was far up the slope, partly hidden by rocks. Whoever it was stood still, facing my direction. I blinked, and when I looked again, the figure was gone. I kept moving. Hours passed. My legs felt like lead, and my mouth was dry. I came across a trickling stream and filled my bottle, filtering the water and gulping it down. I splashed some on my face, hoping the shock of cold would steady me. Later, when I reached a bend in the trail, I stopped short. On the ground lay a backpack. It was old, frayed, and partly torn. The zipper was broken, and the contents had spilled out. A few cans of food, rusted at the edges. A ripped shirt, a water bottle cracked down the side. I knelt and picked through the items. They looked like they had been there for months, maybe longer. The pack was covered in dirt and leaves, weathered from rain and sun. I felt a knot in my stomach. Someone had left it here or never come back for it. The rest of that day dragged on endlessly. My nerves were tight, and every shadow looked like it was moving. By late afternoon, the sky had darkened again, and the wind carried a chill. I needed to make camp, but I was terrified of staying in one place. I finally chose a spot under a cluster of rocks, hoping the shelter would make me feel safer. I set up my tent and crawled inside as the light vanished. I skipped dinner, too uneasy to eat. That night was worse. I heard the footsteps again. This time they didn't just pass by. They stopped, right outside. I lay frozen, my hand gripping the handle of the knife I kept in my pack. The sound lingered, a shuffle, breathing, then nothing. I didn't sleep at all. When dawn came, I packed faster than ever before. My hands shook and I dropped things more than once. I forced myself onto the trail, moving without rest. My only thought was to get back. I knew the route looped back toward the trailhead, but it was still miles away. The path twisted through a dense stretch of forest, the canopy thick above me. The ground was damp and soft, and I saw more prints. Bare feet. Some were fresh. My pace quickened, almost a jog. My lungs burned, and sweat poured down my back. After a while, I heard something behind me, not far, a steady rhythm matching my steps. I turned sharply. There was nothing, but the sound stopped the moment I did. I didn't wait. I ran. Branches whipped against my arms, and the pack bounced painfully on my shoulders. The trail blurred under my feet, but I kept going. I tripped once and slammed my knee into the ground, tearing the skin, but I scrambled up and pressed forward. Hours passed like that, half running, half stumbling. By the time I recognized the ridge from my second day, the sun was already leaning west. I knew I had to keep moving if I wanted to get out before night. I forced myself onward. My legs screamed, and my head throbbed with exhaustion. The forest thinned at last, giving way to lower ground. I pushed through one step after another until I finally saw it. The trailhead. The sight of the empty parking lot almost broke me. My car was still there, waiting, shining in the fading light. I staggered the last stretch, fumbled my keys, and nearly collapsed into the driver's seat. I locked the doors before I even put the key in the ignition. For a long time, I just sat there, gasping, staring at the woods. The trees stood silent, dark against the evening sky. I didn't see anyone, not a single movement. But I knew someone had been out there, watching, following, and they were still there somewhere in those woods. I turned the key, started the engine, and drove away, the forest shrinking in the rearview mirror until it was gone. I have been hiking for years, but one trip in particular still weighs on me. It was supposed to be an ordinary solo hike. Nothing special, just a way to get away from work and noise for a while. I wanted to clear my head, get some exercise, and sleep under the sky. I thought I knew enough about the outdoors to handle whatever came my way. I had been on dozens of trails before, sometimes with friends and sometimes alone. That confidence made me careless, and what happened out there reminded me how quickly things can turn against you when you're alone in the woods. I had taken time off work in late summer. The weather was good, warm in the day, cool at night, no storms in the forecast. I picked a national forest a few hours' drive from my home. I studied a map before leaving and chose a trail that looped through ridges, crossed a river, and passed several primitive campsites. It wasn't the most popular trail, which I liked. I didn't want crowded paths or noisy groups. I wanted quiet, isolation, the feeling of being cut off from everything. The morning I left, I packed everything carefully. A big pack with my tent, sleeping bag, stove, food for 3 days, extra clothes, water filter, knife, first aid kit, flashlight, matches, compass, and map. I even had a whistle and an emergency blanket. I felt prepared. My boots were broken in, and I had worn them on plenty of trips. I had new socks, fresh batteries, and plenty of water to start. I left early, stopped for gas, grabbed some breakfast, and drove until I reached the trailhead. The parking lot was empty when I arrived. Just a dirt patch near the trees with a sign and a faded map. I signed in at the trail register, wrote down my name, date, and expected return. Felt routine. The air was still cool, and the sun was only beginning to burn off the morning haze. The forest smelled of pine and damp soil. I adjusted my pack, tightened the straps, and stepped onto the trail. The first miles were easy. The trail was wide and smooth, with sunlight cutting through the branches overhead. Birds were calling, insects buzzing, and I could hear the faint sound of water down the slope. The forest was beautiful in that early light. The ground was soft with fallen needles, and here and there were patches of ferns and wildflowers. I felt strong, steady, moving at a good pace. As the day warmed, I stopped for water and a snack. I checked my map. The trail forked ahead, one way leading up to a ridge with a lookout point and the other continuing along the river. I decided to take the ridge first. The climb was steep, and I was sweating heavily by the time I reached the top, but the view made it worth it. From there, I could see miles of forest rolling out in all directions, green waves under a pale blue sky. The wind was cool, brushing my face, carrying the smell of pine. I stood there for a while, eating a granola bar, looking at the vastness. It made me feel small in a good way. I descended and followed the trail deeper. The forest grew denser, darker in places. I didn't see another person all morning. That was fine with me. I liked the solitude. Around noon, I found a flat spot near the river and stopped for lunch. The water was clear, moving steadily over rocks. I filtered some into my bottle and sat on the bank, eating jerky and crackers. The only sound was the flow of water and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. After lunch, I kept going. The trail narrowed and grew less distinct. In some spots, fallen branches and brush partially blocked the way. I had to step over logs, push through undergrowth, and check my map more often. I knew I was still on the right path, but it was rougher than I expected. I didn't mind. It made me feel like I was really out there, away from the usual crowded paths. By late afternoon, I reached a small clearing marked on my map as a primitive campsite. It had a fire ring of stones and space for a tent. I decided to set up there for the night. I pitched my tent, collected wood, and cooked a simple meal on my stove. As the sun lowered, the forest grew cooler, shadows stretching long across the clearing. I sat near the fire, listening to the night come alive. Frogs, insects, the distant hoot of an owl. It should have been peaceful, but I felt uneasy. Started subtly, just a prickling on the back of my neck. The forest seemed too quiet at times, then suddenly full of noises I couldn't place. Branches cracking, something moving in the brush. I told myself it was deer, raccoons, maybe a fox. The forest is full of life. Still, I couldn't shake the tension. I doused the fire earlier than planned and zipped myself into the tent. I lay there for a long time, listening to every snap and rustle outside, my heart beating fast. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me under, and I slept. The next morning, I packed up and set out again. I wanted to complete the loop and be back to my car by the following afternoon. The trail beyond the campsite was even less used. In some stretches, it looked more like animal tracks than a human path. I checked my compass, compared it to the map, and kept moving. The forest closed in thicker around me, and the light dimmed. By midday, I realized something was wrong. I expected the trail to cross another river branch, but instead it curved uphill into rocky ground. I pulled out the map again, unfolded it, and studied it. The trail markings were faint, the paper creased and smudged. I thought maybe I had taken a faint side path without noticing. I backtracked for a while, scanning the ground for blazes or cairns. I didn't see any. I walked in circles, trying to match landmarks to the map, but everything started to look the same: trees, rocks, slopes. A heavy feeling settled in my chest. I knew I was off the main trail. I had hiked plenty before, but I also knew how easy it was to get turned around. Panic tried to creep in, but I forced myself to breathe slow. I had a compass, food, water, supplies. I wasn't lost. I told myself I just needed to correct. I picked a direction I thought was right and followed it, trying to intersect the trail again. Hours passed. The ground grew steeper, the forest darker. I kept expecting to hit the river or a clearing, but nothing came. Just endless trees, endless slopes. My legs ached. My pack dug into my shoulders. Sweat soaked my shirt. The sun was lowering again, the light growing gold and dim. I hadn't found the trail. I decided to stop for the night. I found a patch of relatively flat ground, cleared sticks, and set up my tent. I had no firewood and no time to gather much before dark, so I ate a cold meal and lay down. The silence pressed in on me. This time, the sounds outside the tent felt sharper, closer. Something heavy moved in the brush. At one point, I heard what sounded like breathing just outside, steady and low. My chest tightened. I gripped my knife inside the tent, staring into the dark fabric, every muscle tense. Eventually, the noises faded, or maybe I drifted off despite them. The next day, I tried again. I chose a direction and walked. The terrain grew rougher. Fallen trees, gullies, thick undergrowth that tore at my clothes. I tripped more than once, scraped my hands on rocks. My water was running low, so I pushed harder toward where I thought the river should be. When I finally heard water, relief flooded me. I forced my way downhill until I reached a stream. I knelt, filled my bottle, filtered it, drank deeply. But when I looked around, I didn't recognize anything. The stream wasn't on my map. Or maybe it was one of the smaller ones too faint to be marked. The realization hit me hard. I was truly lost now. The trail was gone. The landmarks didn't match, and I had no idea how far I had strayed. The days blurred after that. I wandered, trying to keep track of direction, but everything repeated. Ridges, streams, thickets. My food dwindled. I rationed it, eating less each day. My body weakened, steps slower, mind foggier. I started seeing things move in the corner of my vision. Shadows, flickers, but when I turned, there was nothing. Hunger, exhaustion, fear were playing tricks on me. Nights were the worst. The forest came alive with noises I couldn't explain. Snaps, crashes, rustling. Sometimes I swore something was following me, matching my steps at a distance. I barely slept, lying awake with my knife in hand, heart hammering. On the fourth day, I stumbled onto a patch of old logging road. The ground was scarred, weeds growing through gravel. Relief surged. I thought it would lead somewhere. I followed it for hours, but it ended in overgrowth, swallowed by forest again. My hope collapsed. I sank to my knees, head heavy, feeling utterly defeated. But I forced myself up. I told myself if I kept moving, eventually I'd hit a road, a cabin, anything. I pushed through, step after painful step. My boots rubbed blisters raw, my lips cracked from thirst. I found another stream and drank until my stomach ached. That night I dreamed of rescue, of headlights cutting through the trees, of hands. I had planned the hike for weeks. It was late summer, the kind of season where the days still held heat but the nights began to creep with a sharp chill. I had taken time off work, telling myself I needed a break from screens, noise, and people. I wanted to be out where it was quiet, where I could feel dirt under my boots instead of pavement under my shoes. The plan was simple: a 3-day solo hike along a trail system that looped deep through a remote section of national forest. I had looked at maps, checked the elevation changes, and studied the landmarks. I wasn't new to hiking, but I wasn't some seasoned survivalist either. I was just careful, prepared, and stubborn about finishing what I started. My pack was heavy when I shouldered it that first morning. Tent, sleeping bag, food, stove, water filter, spare clothes, first aid, and the little extras like a flashlight, batteries, and a knife. The map was folded neatly in a waterproof bag, and I had a compass tied to the strap on my chest. The trailhead was empty when I parked. The lot was cracked, weeds pushing through, and the information board stood crooked, sun-bleached, with a few faded warnings about bears, ticks, and staying on marked paths. I remember thinking how quiet it was, the kind of silence that pressed in on you when you cut the engine and stepped out. The first miles were easy. The trail started wide, soft dirt with leaves scattered over it. It wound through tall trees, their branches knitting into a green ceiling. Sunlight speckled the ground. The air smelled of damp earth and pine needles. My boots sank into soft soil, and my legs felt strong. I walked steady, my pack swaying against my shoulders. Hours slipped by like that. Around noon, I stopped near a fallen log to eat. I remember how still the forest was while I chewed on jerky and trail mix. There wasn't much wind. Every sound I made, unwrapping food, shifting on the log, seemed loud. I drank water, checked my map, and felt sure of where I was. That first day, nothing seemed wrong. I set a good pace, passed a small creek, and climbed steadily upward. By late afternoon, I found a flat patch tucked between trees where I decided to camp. The sun dropped low, staining the canopy with orange light. I pitched my tent, boiled water, and ate a hot meal. When darkness came, it was thick and heavy. The woods closed in tight, and I crawled into my tent with only the glow of my headlamp to chase it away. I lay there listening. The forest had its noises, occasional rustles, the snap of a twig, maybe a distant bird, but it was mostly quiet, too quiet at times. My mind played tricks, making me think I heard footsteps out there, slow and deliberate, but I kept telling myself it was animals. Sleep came in pieces, broken by waking up and checking the thin nylon walls around me. The next morning I was stiff but ready. I packed up, shouldered my gear, and kept moving. The trail narrowed now, roots crisscrossing underfoot, the ground steeper. I climbed for hours, sweat soaking my back, until I reached a ridge that opened into a view of rolling forest hills as far as I could see. It was beautiful but also sobering. Out there, I was a speck. If something happened, help wouldn't come fast. By late afternoon, clouds rolled in, dark and swollen. I could smell the storm before it came. Rain fell hard and sudden, soaking me before I could even pull out my poncho. The trail turned slick, mud grabbing at my boots. I slipped more than once, catching myself on trees. The rain hammered the canopy, and thunder cracked overhead. I kept moving because stopping in that downpour felt worse. Eventually, I stumbled into a clearing where I decided to set camp despite the wet. The ground was spongy, and I had trouble staking the tent. My clothes clung to me, cold and heavy. I boiled water for a quick meal, shivering as I crouched over the small stove, the hiss of rain filling my ears. That night was miserable. The rain didn't stop, and water crept under the tent floor, soaking my sleeping bag. I tossed and turned, half awake, teeth chattering. When morning came, the storm had passed, but everything was damp and heavy. My pack weighed twice as much with waterlogged gear. I wrung out my clothes, forced myself to eat, and studied the map again. The loop should have curved me back down by now, but I had a creeping worry that I had taken a wrong spur in the storm. I pressed on. The trail looked rougher now, less defined, as if fewer boots had walked it. Sometimes I lost it altogether, scanning the ground for blazes on trees or disturbed soil. It was slower going, every step cautious. My legs burned, and blisters rubbed on my heels. Hours passed. I checked the map more than I wanted to admit. Landmarks didn't match cleanly. A ridge that should have been narrow stretched longer than it looked on paper. A stream crossed where none was marked. I told myself maps weren't perfect, that trails shifted, but doubt gnawed at me. By afternoon, I was tired, sore, and uneasy. I found another spot to camp, but it didn't feel right. The trees leaned strange, the ground uneven. I set the tent anyway because I didn't have the energy to keep going. That night, I barely slept. I lay there, eyes open, listening. There were noises again, louder than before. Branches snapping, rustles that seemed too heavy for small animals. My heart thumped, and I gripped the knife I kept near my bag. Every time I drifted, I jerked awake. In the gray dawn, I crawled out, my nerves raw. The forest around me seemed different, felt tighter, darker, like it had closed in while I slept. I pushed on, but I couldn't shake the feeling I was deeper off course. The trail disappeared completely in sections. I walked by instinct, trying to follow the slope of the land, checking the compass again and again. Water became a problem. The streams I found were muddy, clogged with debris. I filtered what I could, but it tasted off, metallic, dirty. My stomach cramped after drinking it, and I worried about getting sick. The next day blurred with the one after. Time lost shape. I walked until I couldn't, set camp wherever I could find space, and lay awake through the night. My food supply shrank faster than I wanted to admit. What had been 3 days' worth stretched thin when the hike dragged on. Meals became small handfuls of trail mix, half a protein bar, whatever scraps I could ration. My stomach clawed with hunger. I started seeing signs I wasn't the first one lost out there. A torn piece of cloth snagged on a branch. A boot print half sunk in mud, too big to be mine. At first, it gave me hope. Maybe there were other hikers, maybe I'd run into them. But the longer I thought about it, the more it unsettled me. The prints were old, edges crumbled, not fresh. Whoever left them had either made it out already or hadn't. Nights grew worse. Something moved out there. I'd hear it circling, slow steps breaking twigs, brushing against undergrowth. I never saw anything clear, shadows only, shapes between trees, but the sounds were steady, deliberate. It didn't feel like animals anymore. My chest tightened every time I lay in the tent, waiting for the next snap of a branch. One night, I woke to the sound of something brushing the tent wall, soft like a hand dragging across nylon. I froze, gripping my knife, barely breathing. The sound lingered, then faded. I didn't sleep again after that. The next day, I abandoned the tent. Slowed me down, too heavy and obvious. I carried only the bare minimum: food scraps, water filter, knife, map, compass. I slept curled under trees, barely closing my eyes, starting at every noise. My body ached from exhaustion, my thoughts dull and scattered. On the 5th or 6th day, time was a blur by then, I stumbled onto a trail again. Not wide, not clear, but a path nonetheless, faintly worn through the undergrowth. Relief surged in me. I followed it step after step, heart hammering. The trail wound downhill, the ground firmer, signs of old blazes on trees. I thought I was saved, but as the hours dragged, doubt crept back. The trail grew narrower, the blazes older, faded, nearly invisible. It didn't match anything on my map. Still, I kept going because turning back felt impossible. My legs shook, my lips cracked with thirst. That night, I collapsed beside the trail, too weak to keep walking. I lay there, staring at the dark, waiting for noises that always came. They circled again, closer this time, twigs snapping in slow rhythm. I thought I saw shapes at the edge of the dark, human-shaped but too still. My skin crawled. I clutched the knife, though my hand barely had strength. When morning came, I forced myself up. My body felt hollow, as if it had eaten itself from the inside. I walked slow, dragging my feet, every step an effort. Hours later, I heard something new, the faint hum of a motor, distant, muffled, but real. My chest surged with hope. I staggered toward it, breaking through I always thought I was prepared for the outdoors. I had been hiking for years, taking long-day trips and even a few multi-day treks in the mountains. I read guidebooks, packed carefully, and usually studied the maps until I almost had them memorized. I like to think of myself as cautious, maybe even overly cautious. But that didn't matter on the day. I learned how quickly things can go wrong when you're alone in the woods. It started as a normal plan. I had been wanting to hike a ridge trail in late summer, something more remote than the usual weekend paths. The area was in a state forest, not a national park, so it was quieter, less maintained, and not crowded. That was exactly what I wanted. Solitude, distance from people, and time to clear my head. The morning I set out, the air was cool but humid, the kind of air that makes you sweat even when you're not moving. The sun was hidden behind a hazy layer of clouds, not enough to make it dark, but enough to turn everything into a dull, flat light. I parked at a small pull-off by the forest road, checked my pack, and started up the trail. The first miles were easy. The ground was firm, the trail wide, and I moved quickly. I could hear insects buzzing, leaves shifting in the faint breeze, and the occasional bird calling overhead. I felt good, steady. The forest was thick, mostly hardwoods, with patches of pine and stretches of undergrowth that reached knee-high. I carried a topographic map folded into a plastic sleeve, along with a compass and my phone for GPS backup. I had enough water, food, and a small first aid kit. My plan was simple. Follow the marked trail up to the ridge, loop around, then come down the far side, reconnecting with the forest road about 10 miles away from where I started. From there, I'd walk back along the road to my car. It would be a long day, maybe 12 or 13 miles in total, but nothing I hadn't done before. Things didn't start to feel off until late morning. As I climbed higher, the trail narrowed and became less obvious. Sections were covered in loose rock, and the blazes on the trees were faded, some almost completely gone. At times I had to stop, pull out my map, and double-check that I was still following the right direction. It wasn't alarming, but it slowed me down. I had planned to reach the ridge around midday, but by the time I finally stepped onto the rocky spine, it was already past 1 o'clock. The ridge itself was beautiful, at least at first. The trees opened up, and I could see across miles of forest in both directions. Hills rolled out in green waves, broken only by the occasional logging road or a distant clearing. I dropped my pack, drank some water, and sat on a boulder to eat a snack. That's when I noticed the silence. Usually, even deep in the forest, there's background noise, the constant whine of insects, the chatter of birds, the rustling of leaves. But as I sat there, I realized the ridge was strangely quiet. There was only the wind brushing through the grass and the faint creak of branches. It wasn't complete silence, but it was still enough to make the hair on my neck stand up. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the higher elevation or the season. I packed up, slung the straps over my shoulders, and pushed forward. The ridge trail was rougher than I expected. Rocks jutted up at sharp angles, and thorn bushes crowded the path. I had to pick my steps carefully, testing each foothold before shifting my weight. More than once, I slipped and caught myself on my hands, scraping my palms. The blazes were even more faded here, some hidden behind overgrowth, and I found myself pausing often to look around. By 3 o'clock, I was tired, sweaty, and uneasy. My pace had slowed, and I knew I wouldn't finish the loop before dark. That wasn't part of the plan, and the thought of stumbling along the road by headlamp didn't appeal to me. I decided to cut down from the ridge early, using one of the side trails marked on the map. That was my mistake. The side trail started clear enough, a steep but visible track leading down into a narrow valley. The soil was loose and my boots slid often, but I kept going, thinking once I reached the bottom, the way would level out. The canopy closed above me, dimming the light. The air grew heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth and moss. I could hear water trickling somewhere below, maybe a stream. After 20 minutes, the trail all but vanished. The slope leveled out, but instead of a clear path, I found myself in a mess of underbrush, tangled roots, and fallen logs. I turned in a slow circle, searching for a blaze or a signpost, but there was nothing. The ground was uneven, covered in leaf litter, and the silence from earlier had returned, heavier now. I pulled out my map and compass. According to the paper, the trail should have connected with a creek, then followed it until reaching another marked trail. I figured if I could find the water, I'd be back on track. So I picked a direction where the slope dipped slightly and pushed through the brush. The sound of running water grew louder, and soon I broke through to the creek. It was narrow, no more than 6 feet across, but fast-moving, cutting deep into the soil. The banks were slippery, lined with mud and slick stones. I crouched to refill my water bottle and checked the map again. That's when I realized I had a problem. The creek on the map ran west to east. The one in front of me twisted north to south. Either I had wandered too far, or this wasn't the same stream. I stood there, frowning, listening to the gurgle of water, trying to figure it out. The light was dimmer now, shadows stretching long across the ground. I decided to follow the creek anyway, reasoning it had to connect with something eventually. Streams usually lead to larger rivers, and rivers often cut near roads. It wasn't the perfect plan, but it felt better than wandering aimlessly. I started downstream, keeping close to the bank, moving carefully to avoid slipping. First, it wasn't too bad. The ground was uneven, but there was space to walk. Then the banks narrowed, forcing me onto slick rocks. My boots slipped more than once, and cold water soaked into my socks. I cursed under my breath, though the sound seemed swallowed by the trees. An hour passed. The creek deepened into a small gorge, walls of earth and stone rising on either side. I had no choice but to keep moving forward, the water rushing beside me. My shoulders ached under the pack, and sweat stung my eyes. I stopped to catch my breath and realized how dark it had gotten. The sun was gone, hidden behind the ridge, and the forest was sliding into dusk. I pulled out my headlamp, strapping it on, and the weak circle of light illuminated the wet stones ahead. The sound of the creek echoed in the narrow gorge, masking any other noise. That's when I felt it. Fear, sudden and sharp. It wasn't dramatic, not a rush of panic, but a steady tightening in my chest. I knew I was off trail, far from where I meant to be, and night was falling fast. My map felt useless now. The compass still worked, but pointing myself north meant nothing without a known reference. I was deep in unfamiliar woods, boxed in by a creek I couldn't climb away from. I pushed forward anyway. The gorge went on, twisting, narrowing, then widening again. My light caught on strange shapes. Fallen logs bleached white by the water, jagged stones like teeth, and once, a deer carcass half buried in silt, its bones stark against the mud. The smell was faint but sour, lingering in my nose long after I passed. By the time true night fell, I was exhausted. My legs trembled, and my shoulders burned. I needed to stop. I found a patch of flat ground just above the bank and dropped my pack. My hands shook as I set up my small tarp and sleeping bag. I wasn't hungry, but I forced myself to eat a protein bar, washing it down with a few sips of water. The forest at night was worse. The silence pressed in, broken only by the rushing creek. My headlamp beam bounced from tree to tree, catching shadows that seemed to shift when I looked away. I lay down, pulling the bag tight around my shoulders, but sleep wouldn't come. Every sound made me tense. The splash of water, the crack of a branch, even the faint rustle of leaves. Hours passed like that, me staring into the dark, waiting. At some point, I drifted off, but it was shallow, restless sleep. I woke often, heart pounding, convinced something had moved nearby. Each time, the forest looked the same, empty and dark. When dawn finally came, gray light spilling into the gorge, I felt hollow, drained. My throat was dry, and my muscles ached from lying stiff all night. I forced myself up, packed quickly, and started downstream again. The gorge finally opened into a wider valley, but instead of relief, I felt dread. The creek split into 2 branches, both running in different directions. The map was useless. I couldn't tell which, if either, was marked. I stood there trying to decide when I heard something in the distance. Not an animal, not the creek, It was faint, but I never thought a simple day hike could turn into the longest and scariest night of my life. Looking back now, I know how many little mistakes I made, how many small details I ignored, and how quickly things spiraled out of control once I stepped off the marked trail. It started as an ordinary plan. I wanted to push myself a bit, to hike alone for the day, just me and the mountains. I had always hiked with friends or in groups, but that weekend no one was free. I didn't want to waste the chance because the weather was clear, the sky was sharp blue, and the forecast showed no storms. It felt safe. I had read about a lesser-used trail in the national forest, not one of the popular ones that filled up with families and casual walkers. This one was longer, about 12 miles, and it looped around the backside of a ridge that fewer people visited. I packed the basics: water bottles, a sandwich, a protein bar, a small flashlight, a lighter, a folded map, a thin jacket, and a cheap first aid kit. My plan was to hike fast, finish by late afternoon, and be back at my car before sunset. When I parked at the trailhead, there were only 2 other cars there. The dirt lot was quiet, surrounded by trees. The sun was still high, but the air was cool and smelled like pine. I tightened my boots, adjusted my pack, and started walking. The first few miles were beautiful. The path wound through tall trees, their trunks straight and packed close together, with light spilling through in thin beams. The ground was soft with needles, and every so often the trail would rise to give me a view of the valley below. I passed a small stream where I refilled one of my bottles. I felt calm, almost proud of myself for doing this alone. As I walked, I thought about how people always warned about hiking alone. They mentioned wild animals, injuries, getting lost. I brushed those thoughts off. I felt prepared. I had a map, I had daylight, and I was sticking to a trail. Around mile 6, things shifted. The trail narrowed and seemed less maintained. Fallen branches crossed it. Grass and undergrowth pushed in from the sides. I checked the map, but it didn't show this level of detail, only the general loop around the ridge. The line on the paper didn't match what I was seeing. I told myself it was fine. Trails change with weather and time. I kept going, trying to follow the faint path. At one point, the trail seemed to split. One side went downhill into darker woods, and the other climbed steeply upward. There were no markers. I hesitated, then chose the uphill side, figuring it matched the general direction of the loop. That choice was the beginning of the mistake. The climb was harder than I expected. Loose rocks shifted under my boots. I used my hands to steady myself on roots. My breathing grew heavy. When I finally reached a flatter section, I realized the ground didn't look like a trail anymore. It was just forest floor, uneven and covered in sticks and moss. I looked around but couldn't find a clear path. I pulled out the map again, but it wasn't much help. I knew roughly where I should be, but without trail signs or landmarks, it was just guesswork. I checked the sun and tried to orient myself, telling myself if I kept moving in one direction, I'd hit the loop again. Hours passed that way. I pushed through undergrowth, ducked under branches, and climbed over fallen logs. My legs grew tired. Sweat soaked my shirt. The sun dipped lower, shadows stretching long and thin across the ground. For the first time that day, a cold fear pricked at me. I stopped, trying to listen. The forest was quiet, too quiet. No voices, no distant hikers, no hum of cars. Just the faint rustle of leaves and my own breathing. I decided to turn back the way I came, but when I tried, everything looked the same. The trees repeated in every direction, tall and endless. I couldn't find the steep climb I had made earlier. Panic bubbled up. I forced myself to breathe slow, to think. I still had water, food, and daylight. I wasn't in danger yet. I walked faster, searching for anything that looked familiar. My boots crunched on dry sticks. My heart thudded with every step. The forest thickened, the ground sloped, and I stumbled down into a narrow gully. At the bottom was another stream wider than the first. Its water moved quick, splashing against rocks. I knelt to refill a bottle. The water was icy cold against my skin. For a moment, the sound of rushing water calmed me. I told myself streams often led back toward civilization. If I followed it, maybe I'd find a road or campsite. So I started walking along the bank, keeping the stream to my right. The ground was slippery, forcing me to grab branches to keep balance. The sun slid lower, orange light slanting through the trees. My stomach growled, so I ate half my sandwich while moving. Time dragged on. The stream twisted and bent. I realized I had no idea if I was heading north, south, or anywhere useful. When I stopped to rest, the air had turned colder. My breath puffed white. I pulled on my jacket, but the thin fabric wasn't enough. As darkness fell, my fear grew sharper. The forest no longer felt peaceful. Every snap of a twig made me jerk my head. I imagined animals watching me from the shadows. The thought of being truly lost hit me fully. I wasn't getting back to the car before sunset. When the last light drained from the sky, I used my flashlight. Its beam cut a narrow path ahead, shaky in my tired hand. I searched for a flat spot to stop. I didn't want to keep stumbling in the dark and risk breaking an ankle. I found a patch of ground near the stream where leaves had piled thick. It wasn't comfortable, but it was better than nothing. I gathered some branches and tried to start a fire with my lighter. The sticks were damp, refusing to catch. After many attempts, I gave up and curled into my jacket. The cold sank in deep. That night was endless. I shivered, my body aching. Every sound made me jolt awake. The snap of a branch, the splash of water, the wind sighing through the trees. Once I heard something larger moving nearby, maybe a deer. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst. When morning finally came, gray and pale, I felt weak from lack of sleep. My legs were stiff, my throat dry. I forced myself to eat the protein bar and drink water. I told myself I had to keep moving. Staying put would only make things worse. I followed the stream again, trudging mile after mile. My boots rubbed blisters into my heels. Hunger gnawed at me. I checked my map often, but without knowing my exact spot. It was like staring at random lines on paper. By midday, clouds rolled in. The light dimmed. The air smelled of rain. My fear grew sharper, because rain would make the forest colder, the ground slicker, and the stream more dangerous. And then it happened. I slipped. One moment I was stepping across wet rocks. The next I was on my back, sliding down into the stream. My pack dragged me sideways. Water splashed up, soaking me. I gasped, struggling to get my footing, but the current pushed me forward. My knee slammed into a rock. Pain shot through me. I clawed at the bank, fingers digging into mud, and finally hauled myself out. I lay there, soaked, shivering, clutching my throbbing knee. My flashlight and lighter were gone, swept away. Half my water leaked out of a cracked bottle. Panic surged hard and fast. My supplies were nearly gone. My body hurt, and the forest felt endless. I wanted to scream but swallowed it down. Wasting energy wouldn't help. I forced myself up and limped onward. Every step hurt. My wet clothes clung to my skin, chilling me. Hours blurred together. I started talking to myself in my head, repeating simple things. Keep moving, don't stop, one more step. By evening, I stumbled into a clearing. For the first time in over a day, I saw something man-made. A wooden post with faded paint. It was a trail marker, weathered but still standing. Relief hit me so hard I almost cried. I followed the marker's direction, limping badly but refusing to stop. The trail it led to was rough, overgrown, but still a trail. I knew it had to lead somewhere. That night, I pushed myself harder than ever, even in the dark, because the idea of sleeping another night in the woods terrified me. My flashlight was gone, so I moved slow, feeling the ground with every step. Finally, near midnight, I saw lights through the trees, small, yellow glows. My chest tightened with hope. I stumbled closer until I reached a dirt road. Parked on the side was a ranger's truck with its headlights on. I collapsed on the ground, exhausted, shaking, but safe. They found me because another hiker reported seeing my car still parked at the trailhead overnight. The rangers had been driving the back roads looking for any sign of me. I was lucky. If I hadn't found that marker, I might have wandered deeper into the forest for days. I learned many things that night. about how quickly confidence can turn to fear, about how unforgiving nature is when you're careless, and about how small mistakes, like following the wrong. I had been planning the trip for weeks. I wanted something that felt challenging but not impossible, something remote but still mapped, and something that would push me out of my usual comfort zone without putting me in serious danger. The weather was turning cooler, which made it easier for longer hikes, and I felt restless staying at home. I read about a trail system that cut deep into a forested ridge, where the path was narrow, steep in sections, and known for being underused compared to the popular areas nearby. The idea of being out there alone, moving through the quiet forest without passing crowds of people, made it sound perfect to me. I packed carefully, maybe even too carefully, going over the gear multiple times. I had a reliable backpack with a hydration bladder, a headlamp with fresh batteries, an extra flashlight, 2 lighters, a knife, a compact first aid kit, snacks, protein bars, jerky, a map, compass, and a fully charged power bank for my phone. I wore sturdy boots that had already been broken in, thick socks, and layered clothing that I could adjust if the temperature changed. I carried a lightweight rain jacket even though the forecast looked clear. I thought through what could go wrong and made sure I wasn't reckless. The morning of the hike, I drove out early. The sun was barely over the horizon when I pulled into the small gravel lot near the trailhead. There were no other cars parked there, which made me feel a little nervous but also excited. I liked the idea that this trail was less traveled, but I also knew it meant I wouldn't have people around if something went wrong. The air was crisp, my breath visible in the cool shade of the woods, and the forest was so quiet that I could hear every small movement around me. Leaves shifting, twigs snapping from squirrels, birds calling in short bursts before falling silent again. The trail began as a wide dirt path that quickly narrowed into a corridor of roots and rocks. I moved steadily, paying attention to the way the earth felt beneath my boots. The forest was dense with tall pines and patches of maple, their leaves already changing color into bright oranges and deep reds. The ground was littered with fallen needles and damp leaves that softened my steps. The smell of wet earth and pine sap hung in the air. At first, I felt calm and strong, breathing deeply as I walked. The trail climbed steadily uphill, my legs warming with the effort. I stopped once to check the map, tracing the path with my finger and making sure I understood where it would loop back. I had planned for about 6 hours of hiking, including breaks. I wanted to push myself but still make it back before sunset. I was cautious about that. I knew how fast the forest could grow dark. About an hour in, the trail narrowed so much that I had to step carefully, one foot directly in front of the other. On my right side, the slope fell steeply down into a tangle of brush and trees. On my left, the hillside rose upward like a wall. The ground was uneven, a mix of dirt and jagged stone, and in some places the edge crumbled when I put weight on it. I felt the pull of gravity every time I looked down at the drop, and I forced myself to focus straight ahead. The further I went, the more isolated it felt. I didn't hear any distant voices or footsteps, just the constant hum of insects and the occasional sudden flapping of wings when I startled a bird. The sun filtered through the trees in sharp beams, making patterns across the ground. I lost track of time except for the steady rhythm of walking, stopping briefly for water, and continuing again. Around midday, I reached a ridge where the trees opened up, giving me a view across the valley below. The landscape stretched out in layers of green and brown, with another ridge rising in the distance. I sat for a while on a flat rock, eating jerky and a granola bar. The silence pressed in on me, heavy but also peaceful. I didn't feel watched or unsafe, but I noticed how alone I really was. If I slipped here or got injured, no one would know for hours, maybe days. I tried not to dwell on it and instead enjoyed the quiet. When I got back on the trail, it began to descend, steeper this time. The dirt was loose in sections, and I had to plant my boots firmly to keep from sliding. My thighs burned from controlling each step. After about half an hour of this, the trail leveled briefly before twisting into an even narrower path. The air felt cooler here, more damp, and the trees blocked most of the light. I started noticing signs that animals had passed recently. Broken branches, faint prints in the mud, and even scat in the middle of the path. I couldn't tell what kind of animal had left it, but it made me more alert. I gripped the straps of my backpack tighter and kept moving. The trail eventually crossed a shallow stream. I crouched to refill one of my bottles using the filter I carried, the water icy cold against my hands. I felt calm again after drinking, but as I stood up, I realized how quiet it had become. No bird calls, no insects buzzing, just the faint trickle of water. I paused longer than I meant to, listening, trying to decide if something felt off or if I was only imagining it. I pressed on. The sun had shifted, the light dimming as the afternoon passed. I calculated the time in my head and realized I needed to keep a steady pace if I wanted to make it back before dark. I adjusted my pack and started up another incline, my breath coming harder now. Sweat cooled on my back under the straps. That was when I heard it, a noise behind me on the trail. At first, it was faint, like the sound of a foot scuffing against dirt. I froze, my heart immediately thudding faster. I turned my head, scanning the narrow path behind me. Nothing moved. The trees stood still, their shadows stretching long. I told myself it could have been an animal, maybe even just something falling, a pine cone, a rock. I started walking again, but slower this time. My ears felt tuned to every sound. Minutes later, I heard it again. A distinct shift of weight on the trail behind me, the scrape of stone. My chest tightened. I stopped and turned again, staring hard down the path. My eyes traced every shadow, every trunk, every gap between the branches. The silence pressed against me until my breathing felt too loud. There was still nothing. I forced myself forward, this time faster. My boots landed harder on the ground. My mouth had gone dry, and I kept glancing over my shoulder. I tried to reason with myself. If it was another hiker, they would have caught up by now. If it was an animal, it would probably stay away from me as long as I kept moving. But something in my gut twisted, an instinct that told me I wasn't just imagining it. The trail curved sharply around a boulder. I took the turn quickly and then stopped just out of sight. My chest rose and fell as I held my breath, waiting, listening. For several seconds, there was nothing. Then, faint but clear, I heard the sound again. Footsteps, cautious, dragging slightly as if whoever or whatever it was didn't want to be heard. A cold rush of fear spread through me. This was no deer or bear. This was deliberate. I didn't wait to see. I pushed forward harder, almost jogging despite the uneven ground. My pack shifted against my shoulders, and I gripped the straps to keep it from bouncing too much. My boots slipped once on the dirt, nearly sending me to my knees, but I caught myself and kept going. The trail twisted and climbed again, and my lungs burned with the effort. Every time I thought I was moving fast enough to break away, I heard it again. Always behind me, always just faint enough to make me doubt, but close enough to keep me terrified. The trail grew steeper, the slope on my right dropping away sharply. I had to balance carefully even as I tried to hurry. My legs shook with exhaustion, but adrenaline kept me moving. I glanced back once more, but the shadows gave nothing away. By the time I reached the next ridge, the light had thinned to a gray dimness. I could see the valley below again, the trees blurred together in the fading sun. I stopped, bent over, gasping for breath. My heart pounded so hard I thought I might pass out. That was when I heard the footsteps again, much closer now. I spun around, my eyes wide. At first I saw nothing, then movement, a shape pulling back into the trees just before I could focus on it. My body went cold. Someone was out there, keeping just far enough to stay hidden but close enough to follow. I didn't shout. I didn't try to call out. Some instinct told me it would only make things worse. Instead, I turned and began moving as fast as I could down the other side of the ridge. The trail narrowed dangerously, the ground crumbling beneath my boots. My legs ached, my throat dry and raw, but I didn't stop. Every so often, I caught another sound, a shift, a snap of a twig, a deliberate step, always following. The forest darkened quickly. I pulled my headlamp from my pack, fumbling to strap it on as I walked. The bright beam cut through the trees, bouncing wildly with my movements. Shadows seemed to jump at the edges of the light. I kept glancing back, shining the beam down the trail behind me. At one point, I thought I saw a shape, tall, hunched slightly, slipping behind a tree before I could get a clear look. My stomach dropped. I wasn't imagining this. Someone was following me. I pushed harder, I had planned the hike for months. It was supposed to be a long weekend escape from work, a way to clear my head and enjoy some quiet away from the noise of town. I picked a trail that wasn't extremely popular but still showed up on maps. It wound through a deep gorge, followed a river upstream, and climbed into forested ridges with views of valleys and distant hills. I had read about it in a small hiking blog and it seemed challenging but not extreme. I was in my early 30s, healthy, and had done several multi-day hikes before, so I didn't think too much of it. The trailhead was small, only a dirt pull-off with enough room for a couple of cars. When I parked early that morning, no one else was around. The air was cool, and the smell of damp soil and pine needles filled my lungs as I stepped out. I packed light but careful. A tent, sleeping bag, stove, food for 3 days, water filter, first aid kit, flashlight, and an extra layer of clothes. I wore sturdy boots and carried a map folded into a waterproof sleeve. I had checked the weather, which showed mild days and cool nights with no storms expected. It seemed perfect. The first part of the trail followed the river through thick trees. The water moved quickly over smooth rocks, making a constant rushing sound. Birds called from above, and squirrels darted across the path. The morning sun cut through gaps in the trees, painting long streaks of light on the ground. My pack felt heavy at first, but my body adjusted as I fell into rhythm. Step after step, I felt myself settle into the hike. By midday, I reached a section where the gorge narrowed. High walls of stone rose on both sides, and the river cut through the middle. The trail hugged the left side, carved into the slope. It wasn't dangerous, but the ground was uneven, with roots and loose stones. I walked carefully, feeling my balance with every step. Hours passed. I didn't see a single person. It wasn't unusual. Many hikers avoided this area since it was less maintained than popular trails. That solitude had drawn me here in the first place, but as the sun lowered, I noticed how silence grew heavier. The sound of the river echoed, but there were fewer bird calls, less movement in the trees. I checked my map and decided to camp near a bend in the river where the gorge opened slightly. I found a flat patch of ground a little above the water. The soil was damp but firm enough for my tent stakes. I gathered some wood for a small fire, cooked noodles, and ate slowly as dusk deepened. Shadows stretched across the gorge, and the rushing water became louder as the forest stilled. When I crawled into my tent, I felt content but alert. It always took me a while to relax on the first night outdoors. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves carried into the tent walls. I tried to remind myself that most noises came from animals. Deer, raccoons, small creatures moving at night. I slept lightly, waking often. Sometime after midnight, I heard movement close to camp. The sound was heavy, like something large stepping on sticks. I held still, listening. My heart beat fast as I imagined a bear moving nearby. I had hung my food from a tree away from the tent, but the fear lingered. The noise lasted a while, then faded. I never saw what it was. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me back to sleep. Morning light came with relief. I crawled out of the tent and scanned the area. Nothing seemed disturbed. My food bag still hung where I left it. The ground around the camp didn't show clear tracks. I convinced myself it was probably a deer. After breakfast, I packed up and pushed further upstream. The gorge widened, and the trail climbed into steeper ground. I felt the strain in my legs but enjoyed the views of cliffs and forest. By afternoon, clouds moved in, muting the sun. A faint breeze carried a chill, and the woods grew darker. I checked the map again. According to it, the trail looped back onto a ridge that eventually returned toward the trailhead. But as I hiked, I came to a junction that wasn't marked on the map. A narrow path split from the main one, sloping upward. There was no signpost, no marking, just a faint trail. I paused, studied the map again, and tried to match landmarks. The main path seemed to keep near the river, but I wondered if the upper trail might cut toward the ridge faster. I decided to follow it. The path climbed steeply, weaving through dense pines. At first, it looked worn enough to trust, but after an hour, it narrowed and became harder to follow. Fallen branches covered parts, and thick undergrowth pressed in. Still, I kept climbing, expecting it to rejoin the main loop. By late afternoon, I realized I hadn't seen the river for a while. My water bottle was low, and I counted on refilling it at the next stream. The air was damp and cold now, the kind that settled into clothes and skin. I pushed higher, hoping for a clearing. When I finally stopped, I admitted to myself I might have taken the wrong turn. I checked the map again, but nothing matched exactly. The gorge walls below were hidden by trees, and I had no clear view of where I was. I decided to descend a bit and try to find the main trail again. But going back down proved harder. The slope was steep, the ground slick with loose soil. I slipped several times, catching myself on trees. At one point, I slid a few feet and scraped my leg on a rock. The cut wasn't deep, but blood soaked into my sock. I cleaned it quickly and wrapped it with a bandage from my kit. As daylight faded, I realized I wouldn't reach the main trail before night. I needed to camp again. I found a small flat spot beneath tall pines. My hands shook slightly as I pitched the tent, partly from cold, partly from nerves. For dinner, I forced down a granola bar and some dried fruit. That night, the forest felt different. It was darker, heavier. I heard fewer natural sounds and more unsettling ones. Branches snapping in sharp bursts, like footsteps. At one point, I swore I heard something move close to the tent and then stop. I lay frozen, clutching my knife, ears straining. The noise didn't return, but I barely slept. Morning brought no comfort. My food supply was still fine, but I needed water. My throat was dry, and I only had a few sips left. I packed up quickly, determined to find the river again. I descended cautiously, aiming toward where I thought the water should be. Hours passed. The slope twisted, and the woods thickened. I felt disoriented. The gorge wasn't visible, and no sound of rushing water reached me. My legs grew tired, and my cut burned with each step. I stopped often, trying to listen, but only wind moved through the trees. Eventually, I stumbled onto a faint animal trail. It wound downward, narrow but clear. I followed it, hoping it would lead to water. Instead, it brought me to a tangle of brush that tore at my clothes. I pushed through, branches scratching my face and arms. When I emerged, I stood at the edge of a steep drop. Below, far down, I could see a thin silver line of water. Relief rushed through me, but the slope was dangerous, covered in loose rocks. I sat for a while, weighing my options. I couldn't survive without water much longer. Carefully, I began descending, testing each step. Halfway down, my boots slipped on gravel. I fell hard, sliding several feet before slamming into a tree. Pain shot through my side, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. When I caught my breath, I checked myself. My ribs hurt badly, and bruises were already forming, but nothing felt broken. Slowly, shaking, I continued. By late afternoon, I reached the stream. I dropped to my knees, filled my bottle, and drank deeply. The cold water tasted like life itself. For a while, I just sat, breathing, listening to the flow. But I knew I couldn't relax. I was still lost. I tried following the stream downstream, figuring it might rejoin the main river. But the banks were rough, blocked with fallen logs and thick brush. Progress was slow, and the light was fading again. My body ached, my leg throbbed, and fear grew heavier with each step. That night, I set camp near the stream. I was exhausted but couldn't eat much. My stomach twisted with worry. Sleep came in short bursts. I woke often to noises, something moving through the undergrowth, splashes in the water. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow pass near the edge of camp, but it was too dark to be sure. The next day, I pushed on. My pace slowed as pain grew in my leg. My supplies thinned. I rationed food, taking only small bites every few hours. The stream wound endlessly, never showing signs of joining the main river. By the fourth day, I was weak. My face felt sunken, lips cracked, and my body shivered despite wearing all my clothes. My map seemed useless now. I couldn't match any feature to it. The forest felt endless, the gorge walls hidden in mist and trees. That evening, as I sat by a small fire, I thought about the trailhead, my car, the simple noise of traffic I once took for granted, the fear I had been planning a long solo hike for weeks. It was something I often did when life felt heavy, when I needed the silence of the woods to clear out all the noise in my head. Hiking alone gave me a kind of focus that nothing else could. There were no phones ringing, no emails, no pointless chatter, just the sound of my boots on dirt, my lungs working, and the endless trees all around me. I picked a section of trail in the mountains that I had never done before. I studied maps online, traced the routes with my finger on the screen, read a few trail reports, and felt confident enough. It was marked as a strenuous hike, but not anything technical. Around 20 miles round trip if I followed the loop, with about 3,000 feet of elevation gain. Nothing I hadn't done before. I packed carefully the night before. Water filter, plenty of snacks, a small cooking stove, extra layers, headlamp, first aid kit, and a map folded neatly in a plastic bag. My backpack felt heavy when I tried it on, but I told myself it would feel lighter once I got moving. The morning of the hike was cool and gray. Clouds hung low over the hills, and the air felt damp but not yet rainy. I parked at the trailhead around 7 and saw only one other car there. That reassured me in a way. I liked solitude, but knowing someone else was out there felt like a quiet safety net. I locked my car, adjusted my pack, and set off. The first few miles were calm. The trail wound through tall trees, their trunks slick with moss. The ground was soft with old leaves and mud. I could smell the wet earth and pine needles, that mix of freshness and decay that never exists anywhere except the forest. Birds called out, though their voices were muffled by the damp air. My boots left prints in the mud, and occasionally I saw the faint tread of someone else's shoes from days before. After about 4 miles, the trail began to climb more steeply. The switchbacks seemed endless, and I leaned on my trekking poles with every step. Sweat gathered under my jacket even though the air was cool. I stopped for water, pulled my hood tighter against the mist, and pushed on. The trees thinned as I gained height, giving me glimpses of the valleys below. Everything looked washed in gray. Around noon, I reached a ridge where the trail forked. My map showed the main loop going left, the longer branch veering right before reconnecting. I thought about time. If I took the longer way, it would probably add 3 or 4 miles, but I had started early and felt strong. I decided to take the right fork. That decision would change the entire day. The ridge trail was narrower and rougher. Fallen branches blocked parts of it, and the ground was slippery with loose rocks. Still, the sense of being on less traveled ground excited me. I liked trails that felt wild. I stopped at a rocky outcrop and ate a granola bar, staring out at the stretch of forest that seemed to go on forever. Wind pushed at my back, carrying a chill. The descent on the far side of the ridge was steeper than I expected. My thighs burned from bracing myself, and I had to slow down to keep balance. The ground grew muddier the lower I went, and soon I realized I was dropping into a valley I hadn't paid much attention to on the map. The trees closed in, taller and denser. Everything down there felt darker, even though it was still early afternoon. When I finally reached the valley floor, the trail became hard to follow. Fallen leaves had buried parts of it, and water from recent rains had carved small channels through the dirt. I pulled out my map, trying to orient myself. The lines and marks suddenly looked vague, like they didn't match the place I stood in. I walked forward a bit, found a blaze on a tree, and kept going. For the next half mile, I followed what looked like trail, though it grew fainter. The quiet pressed down heavier. The sound of birds had thinned out, and the only noise was the soft squelch of my boots in mud. At one point, I stopped and realized I hadn't seen another blaze in a long while. A prickling sensation crawled up my neck. I told myself not to panic. People lose the trail sometimes. That's why I had the map and compass. I backtracked to the last place I had felt sure of, then tried a slightly different line forward. Still no blazes. The valley twisted in strange ways, with fallen logs, dense brush, and small creeks crisscrossing the floor. Every direction looked similar. The minutes dragged into what felt like an hour. My chest grew tight, and I realized I had wasted energy wandering back and forth. I stopped moving and forced myself to breathe. I unfolded the map again, traced the ridge I had come down, and tried to match the landforms around me. But the valley had so many branches, so many gullies, that nothing lined up cleanly. The realization came slowly but heavily. I had lost the trail. At first, I felt a flare of anger at myself. How could I let that happen? I was usually careful, but anger gave way to something colder, fear. The sky above the valley was dimming, the gray clouds thickening into something darker. Rain was coming. I still had several hours before nightfall, but every minute mattered now. I decided to head uphill, figuring the higher I got, the easier it would be to reorient myself. Climbing through the brush was exhausting. Branches whipped against my jacket, mud clung to my boots, and my pack felt like it had doubled in weight. My thighs ached from earlier climbs, but I forced myself upward. After what felt like half an hour, I reached a small rise. From there, I could see more of the valley, but it didn't help much. It was just endless trees, folds of land stretching in every direction. No clear ridge trail, no human sign. The wind carried the first drops of rain, cold against my cheek. I knew I couldn't afford to wander blindly, so I tried to make a plan. I took out my compass and lined it with the map, guessing where the main loop might be. I picked a direction that I thought would angle me back toward it. I started moving steadily, checking my compass every few minutes. The rain picked up, soaking through the forest. Water dripped from branches, turning the ground slick. My gloves became wet and cold, and soon my body started shivering. I pushed harder, my breaths coming out ragged. Every so often, I stopped, convinced I heard something. Maybe a branch snapping somewhere deeper in the woods. Each time, I froze, heart pounding, scanning the trees, but nothing revealed itself. By late afternoon, the light had dimmed so much it felt like evening already. My legs trembled from effort, and I admitted the truth. I wasn't going to find the trail again before dark. The thought of spending the night in the valley made my stomach sink, but I had to face it. I needed shelter. I found a cluster of thick trees on slightly higher ground and set my pack down. My hands shook as I pulled out the small tarp and paracord I always carried. I rigged a crude lean-to between two trunks, low to the ground to block some wind. I spread my emergency blanket inside, sat down, and hugged my knees to my chest. Rain drummed on the tarp, water dripping steadily. The hours dragged painfully. I ate a protein bar even though I wasn't hungry, knowing I needed energy. Darkness closed in completely, and with it came a deep, suffocating silence. My headlamp cast a narrow beam, but I turned it off to save batteries. Sitting in pitch dark, I listened to the forest. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made my pulse spike. My mind kept imagining figures out there, shapes moving just beyond sight. I told myself it was animals, deer, raccoons, maybe a bear, but that didn't calm me much. Sleep came in short bursts, broken by shivering. My clothes were damp, and the cold dug deep into my bones. At one point, I thought I heard heavy steps moving not far from my shelter, slow and deliberate. My chest seized with terror. I held my breath, ears straining. The steps faded, but I never knew if they were real or just my mind tricking me in the dark. When dawn finally came, it was weak and gray. I crawled out stiff and aching, my body screaming with fatigue. My tarp had sagged under the weight of water, and everything smelled of wet earth and decay. I forced myself to eat a little, then studied the map again. The only option was to keep moving. For the next several hours, I climbed steadily uphill, trying to reach a ridge where I might spot landmarks. My legs burned with every step, and blisters throbbed on my feet. The rain had eased, but mist clung to everything, making the forest look endless. At times I thought I heard voices carried on the wind, faint and distant, but when I stopped to listen, there was only silence. By midday, I stumbled onto what looked like an old trail, overgrown, faint, but there. Relief surged through me. I followed it with renewed energy, though doubt nagged at me. The trail seemed too narrow, too rough, almost like it hadn't been used in years. Still, it was something. The trail wound upward for what felt like hours, cutting across gullies and weaving between cliffs. Several times, loose rocks gave way under my boots, sending me sliding dangerously close to edge. I never thought a simple hike could turn into the worst and longest day of my life. When I left my house that morning, my pack felt light, my boots were tied tight, and the weather was calm. I had looked at the map many times and I knew the trail I wanted to take. It was supposed to be a full-day loop through the mountains, nothing extreme, just a long trail with some steep climbs and a section along a ridge that people said had beautiful views. I had done plenty of hikes before, some even longer than this one, so I told myself it would just be tiring at most. The first part of the trail was easy. It wound through tall pines, the air cool and fresh. My steps felt light, and I found a rhythm quickly. The trail was dirt mixed with rock, firm under my boots. Every now and then I passed small streams where I stopped to splash water on my face. I was alone, but I didn't feel uneasy. Being alone in the woods had always been something I enjoyed. The quiet gave me space to think, and the sounds of birds and wind always felt more natural than the constant noise of town. The climb grew steeper after about an hour. Roots and rocks stuck out of the ground, forcing me to lift my feet higher. My breathing became heavier, sweat gathered under my shirt, and my shoulders grew sore from the straps of my pack. I pushed through it, stopping now and then to rest against a tree and drink water. The sky above was a steady gray, no sign of storm, but not much sun either. The weather felt fine for hiking. As the trail twisted higher, the forest thinned. Trees stood farther apart, and the ground turned rocky. I knew I was getting close to the ridge section. That was the part one had both looked forward to and worried about. The map had a warning about narrow paths and steep drop-offs. I wasn't someone afraid of heights, but I respected them. One slip in a place like that could mean the end. I told myself to stay careful, to take it slow. When I reached the ridge, I stopped and looked out. The view spread wide, mountains rolling in the distance, valleys below covered in green. Clouds drifted low, their shadows moving over the land like slow waves. The path in front of me was thin, only wide enough for one person at a time. On my left was a steep wall of rock, and on my right was nothing but open air and a drop so far down I couldn't see the bottom. The trail followed the ridge for what looked like half a mile before turning back into trees on the other side. I stepped carefully, placing each foot flat and steady. The ground was rough stone mixed with loose gravel. My boots slipped slightly a few times, making my heart jump. I leaned toward the rock wall whenever I could, trying to keep my center away from the edge. The silence up there was heavy, only broken by wind brushing across the ridge. My hands tingled with tension. About halfway across, I noticed something that made me stop. A section of the trail ahead had crumbled away. It wasn't a long gap, maybe 4 feet across, but the path on the other side was lower and angled. The rock around it looked loose. I stared at it for a long time, my chest tight. Turning back wasn't something I wanted to do, because that meant adding hours to my return. I thought I could step over it if I was careful, maybe sit down and scoot across with my legs stretched. I set my pack down, checked the straps on my boots, and studied the best way to cross. The gap sloped downward into empty space. One mistake meant falling. I crouched, lowered myself, and pushed my body forward, stretching my legs until my boots reached the other side. I held my weight on my arms, slid slowly, then pulled myself across. My stomach turned as rocks crumbled under my boot, but I managed to shift my weight and roll onto the safe part. My hands shook when I stood up again. The path narrowed even more after that. I kept moving, forcing myself not to freeze. When I finally reached the trees on the far side, I let out a long breath and sat down on a boulder. My arms and legs felt weak. I drank more water and ate a snack, trying to calm my body. I told myself the worst part was behind me, but it wasn't. The trail after the ridge sloped downward through rough forest. The ground was damp, and patches of moss made it slippery. I moved slower, watching each step. The trail markings were faint, small blazes on trees that I sometimes had to search for. After an hour, I reached a section where the trail split. My map showed only one path, but here were two. Both looked worn. I chose the left one, thinking it matched the direction I needed to go. That decision was the mistake that changed everything. The path grew thinner, almost hidden by undergrowth. Branches whipped against my arms. My boots sank into soft mud in places. I told myself it was just a rougher part of the loop, but doubt crept in when I realized I hadn't seen any trail markings for a long time. I stopped and checked the map again. Nothing matched what I saw. The trees pressed close, blocking the sky. I thought about turning back, but the path behind me was just as twisted. I convinced myself to keep moving, hoping it would rejoin the main trail. Instead, it dropped steeply down a hillside. I tried to control my steps, but the ground was slick. My foot slipped, my body lurched, and I tumbled hard, rolling down into the brush. Pain shot through my shoulder when I landed, and my legs scraped against rock. I sat up, dizzy and sore. My hands were scratched, my clothes torn. My pack had slid halfway off but stayed on. I checked myself. Nothing broken, but my shoulder hurt badly, stiff and throbbing. I got back on my feet slowly, leaning against a tree. The slope I had fallen down was too steep to climb back up easily. I looked around and realized I couldn't even see the path anymore. All I saw were trees, rocks, and thick brush. My chest grew tight. I was off the trail completely now. I tried walking in the direction I thought the trail had gone, but the ground twisted, and every way looked the same. My boots sank in moss, branches snapped underfoot, and sweat stung my eyes. I pulled out my compass and tried to match it with the map, but with the pain in my shoulder and the panic building inside me, it was hard to focus. Hours passed like that. My legs grew heavy. The forest seemed endless. I heard the sound of running water and thought it might help me find my way, since trails often follow streams. I followed the sound until I reached a creek cutting through the rocks. The water was cold, rushing fast. I refilled my bottle and washed the blood from my scraped leg. The sting made me clench my teeth. I followed the creek downstream, hoping it would lead to something, a bigger river, maybe even a road. The forest grew darker as clouds thickened. Soon rain started, light at first, then harder. The ground turned slick, and the creek swelled. I kept slipping on wet rocks. My pack grew heavier with the water soaking into it. By evening, I was shivering. My clothes were soaked, and the temperature dropped fast. I looked for a dry spot to set up my small tent, but everything was muddy. Finally, I found a patch of ground under thick trees where less rain reached. I set up the tent clumsily with my sore shoulder, then crawled inside. The cold followed me even there. I ate a little food, wrapped myself in my sleeping bag, and listened to the rain pound the fabric. Sleep came in short bursts. I woke often, hearing cracks in the forest, branches breaking, maybe animals moving nearby. My heart pounded each time. I gripped the small knife I carried, even though I knew it wouldn't help much against anything big. Morning brought no comfort. The rain had stopped, but fog lay thick, blurring everything. My body ached from the fall and from the cold night. I forced myself to pack up and keep moving. The creek was higher now, rushing loud. I followed it, stepping carefully along the bank. Hours passed, and still nothing but forest. I began to understand how people disappeared out here, how easy it was to think you were moving in the right direction but only sink deeper into nowhere. My water was running low again, my food lighter. My legs felt weak, and each uphill climb drained me. At one point, the creek cut into a narrow gorge. The sides rose steep, slippery with moss. I tried to walk along the edge but slipped and nearly fell in. I sat down, breathing hard, shaking from the close call. The thought of dying out there began to creep in. Not from anything dramatic, just from slow exhaustion, cold, hunger. I pushed it away and kept going. By late afternoon, the sound of something new reached me. A faint hum, almost mechanical. My heart jumped. I pushed through thick brush until I saw it. a power line cutting through the trees, stretching across the valley. Relief washed over me. Power lines meant people, meant roads somewhere. I followed the cut under the lines, the ground rough but open. It still took hours, but finally I saw a dirt road cutting across. My legs nearly gave out when I reached it. I sat on the edge, head in my hands, breathing hard. I walked that road until night fell, my body dragging but my mind locked on the thought of safety. At last, headlights appeared in the distance. A truck came rumbling down the road. I stepped into the open. I had been planning the hike for months. The trail was in a national forest several hours away from where I lived, and I had seen photos of it online. The path cut through deep woods, climbed ridges, and dropped into valleys that looked untouched by people. It wasn't the kind of place where you would see crowds. That was exactly what I wanted. I wanted a stretch of quiet, a place to move through trees and rocks where all I had to think about was putting one foot in front of the other. I left home early in the morning while it was still dark, my backpack already packed with what I thought I would need. A tent, sleeping bag, food for a few days, extra water, a small stove, a headlamp, a first aid kit, and a knife I always carried when I went outdoors. I had hiked many shorter trails before, but this one was supposed to be more remote, with long sections where you wouldn't find other people. That idea made me excited and uneasy at the same time. The drive took hours. The sky grew brighter, the sun finally rose, and by the time I reached the small parking lot near the trailhead, there were only a few other cars. The air was cool, the kind that feels fresh in your lungs, and the forest around me was quiet except for birds. I adjusted the straps on my backpack, checked that I had locked my car, and then stepped onto the dirt path that disappeared into the trees. The first miles were easy. The ground was firm, the air smelled of pine, and beams of sunlight cut through the branches. I kept a steady pace, enjoying the rhythm of walking. The trail slowly climbed upward, and after a while I could look down through the trees and see parts of the valley floor far below. Everything looked untouched, wild. I didn't hear any other people. I liked that. After a few hours, I stopped to drink water and eat some trail mix. My shoulders already felt the weight of the pack, but it was manageable. I wanted to make good progress before the afternoon, because the plan was to hike all day and then camp near a river I had seen marked on the map. The deeper I went, the quieter the forest became. The sound of cars from the road was gone. Even the birds seemed more spread out, their calls faint in the distance. The trail narrowed, twisting between roots and rocks, and sometimes I had to watch my footing carefully. It felt wild in a way that was different from the smaller trails near my home. By midday, I was sweating hard, the sun warm overhead whenever I stepped into a clearing. I checked the map and saw that the river was still a long way off. I pushed myself to keep moving. Then I noticed something small but strange. The path ahead had fresh boot prints. That wasn't unusual since people obviously used the trail, but these looked recent, pressed into damp soil from rain earlier in the week. The prints were deep, like the person had been carrying something heavy. I looked behind me at the way I had come, and I realized I hadn't seen anyone all morning. I told myself it didn't matter. Someone else was probably out here hiking ahead of me. Still, it made me think about how empty the woods were. I hadn't seen a single person in hours, yet someone was not too far ahead. I kept going. The day stretched on and my legs grew sore. By the time I reached the river, the sky was already beginning to shift toward evening. The water was wide and moved fast, with rocks breaking the surface and the sound of rushing filling the air. I found a flat spot a short distance from the bank where the ground was soft enough for my tent. I set it up slowly, my arms stiff, my body tired. After I got the tent ready, I boiled some water and made a simple meal. The forest around me darkened. The river made a steady noise that covered smaller sounds, which I realized was both calming and unnerving. It meant I couldn't hear what might be moving nearby. I sat for a while, ate, and watched the light fade. Before turning in for the night, I went down to the water's edge to wash my face. That's when I noticed it. Across the river, on the far bank, there was a flat area where the trees opened up. And in that clearing was a fire pit. The black circle of ash was clear even from my side. I stared at it. It didn't look old. The stones were stacked neatly, the ash still looking dark, not washed away by rain. Someone had camped there, maybe recently. I looked around, scanning the other side of the river. I didn't see anyone. Still, my skin prickled. Back in my tent, I tried to shake it off. Lots of people camp along rivers. Maybe the person who left the prints I had seen earlier had stayed there. I told myself I was fine. The tent was small, but it felt like a barrier between me and the rest of the woods. I zipped the door shut and listened to the water. That night, I didn't sleep well. I woke up often, sweating in my sleeping bag, my ears straining for sounds beyond the rush of the river. Once I thought I heard something heavy moving through brush, but it could have been an animal. I stayed still until I finally drifted off again. When morning came, the forest was gray with mist. I crawled out of the tent, stiff and groggy. The air was cold on my face. I packed up slowly, ate a quick breakfast, and started walking again. The trail crossed a wooden bridge further upstream, and when I got to the other side of the river, I couldn't resist checking the clearing I had seen the night before. I walked over to it. The fire pit was definitely recent. The ash was black, unscattered, and there were even bits of wood that hadn't fully burned. Around it were marks on the ground where someone had set their gear. I noticed something else too. A long, thin piece of paracord was tied between two trees at shoulder height, as if someone had been hanging clothes or food. The cord was still there, swinging slightly in the breeze. I felt uneasy again. Whoever had stayed here hadn't left long ago. Maybe they were still out here somewhere. I moved back to the trail and kept walking. The hours stretched. The sun came up higher, and the mist burned away. The trail grew rougher, climbing over ridges where the ground was nothing but roots and loose rocks. I slipped once and scraped my palm, but it wasn't bad. The woods here felt thicker, darker. I noticed fewer signs of animals, fewer birds. The silence pressed down on me. By afternoon, I came across something that stopped me. It was a sock. It lay half buried in leaves beside the trail. It was dirty, stretched out and damp, but it was clearly a sock someone had dropped. I stared at it for a long time. It looked like it had been here maybe a few days, not long enough to be faded or chewed by animals. I walked on, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. The trail curved, and not much farther ahead I saw something else. A torn plastic bag, snagged in a bush. It flapped in the breeze. The edge was ripped, as if someone had pulled at it. I felt my chest tighten. The forest no longer felt like open wild space. It felt watched. I moved faster, my legs aching. The day wore on, and I forced myself to keep going until evening. I found a spot to camp in a small clearing uphill from the trail. I tried to calm myself by boiling water for food, setting up my tent, and following the same routine as the night before. But as I sat there, I couldn't shake the thought of the sock, the bag, the fire pit. Someone was moving through these woods too, and I hadn't seen a single person since I started. That night was worse. I lay in the tent, eyes open, the fabric glowing faintly from moonlight. I heard something, a crack of a branch, then silence. My throat was dry. I didn't move. I told myself it was an animal, a deer, a raccoon, anything, but the sound had been heavy. I gripped the knife in my hand and stayed that way for hours. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me into sleep, but it was thin, restless sleep, full of jolts awake at the slightest sound. In the morning, I was drained. My eyes burned, my body ached. I stuffed everything back into my pack and forced myself onto the trail again. As the hours went by, I thought I heard footsteps behind me. I would stop, hold my breath, listen. The forest would be silent except for a faint breeze. Then I would keep moving faster. The fear built with every mile. Late in the afternoon, I came around a bend and froze. There, in the dirt of the trail, were fresh boot prints, deep ones. The tread was different from my boots. They were pointed the same direction I was walking. I looked back. I thought I saw movement far down the trail, just for an instant. A figure. Then it was gone, hidden by trees. My stomach dropped. I pushed myself harder, moving quickly, sweat soaking my shirt despite the cool air. My lungs burned. I didn't want to stop. Every time I looked back, I thought I saw the faintest shadow of movement. The trail finally descended toward another stream. I crossed on rocks, stumbled on the far side, and found a small hollow among trees. I didn't want to camp, but I had no choice. My legs wouldn't carry me much farther. I set up the tent with shaking hands. I didn't cook. I didn't eat. I crawled inside and sat with the knife across my lap, staring at the thin walls of fabric. That night, I barely slept. I heard footsteps in the brush. Slow, deliberate. They came and went, as if someone was circling. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow pass across the faint glow of the... I had always enjoyed hiking alone. There was something about being out in the woods that made me feel both calm and alive at the same time. I liked the quiet, the long stretches of trail where I heard nothing but the crunch of my boots, the rustle of leaves, and the distant sound of birds. It felt like a break from everything else in life. That was why, when I planned a weekend trip last fall, I chose a long, less traveled trail in a national forest a few hours away from where I lived. I wanted space, quiet, and distance from people. The trail I picked was about 15 miles in and 15 miles out. I planned to hike halfway in, camp overnight, and return the next day. It was the kind of trail where you wouldn't find many others unless you went in the summer. By late October, most people had already packed away their gear for the season. The air had that sharp chill of fall, and the trees were halfway through losing their leaves. The map showed creeks, steep ridges, and even a small fire tower that was abandoned years ago. That tower was the main reason I picked the trail. I wanted to see it before it rotted away completely. I woke up early, packed light but carefully, and drove to the trailhead. The parking lot was empty when I arrived. That gave me a small thrill, knowing I would likely be out there alone. I signed the logbook at the start of the trail, shouldered my pack, and began walking. The first few miles felt normal. The trail was narrow in places, covered in wet leaves that made the ground slippery. I kept a steady pace and tried to notice little things around me. Mushrooms pushing through rotting logs, the way the air smelled like damp soil, a hawk circling high above a clearing. About 4 miles in, I came to a long ridge where the trees thinned out and the wind was stronger. The trail dropped steeply on both sides, and I had to watch my step. At the end of the ridge, I saw something strange. In the dirt of the trail, there was a fresh boot print. That shouldn't have been odd, but the logbook back at the trailhead showed no one else had signed in for the day. The print looked recent. I crouched down and touched it. The edges were sharp, not softened by rain or wind. Someone was out here and they hadn't signed in. I stood there for a while, staring at it. It wasn't unusual for people to skip the logbook, but something about it put me on edge. The print was large, bigger than mine, and the tread was heavy like work boots. I brushed it off and kept going, but I kept glancing at the ground. Every so often, I saw another print, always the same tread, always pointed in the same direction I was going. Whoever it was, they were ahead of me. By the time I reached the creek around mile 7, the sun was lower. I filled my bottle, ate a quick snack, and looked around. The woods were quiet, too quiet. Even the birds seemed absent. I scanned the bank and saw another boot print in the mud, fresh again. It made me feel uneasy, like I was following someone I wasn't meant to follow. I pushed on, trying to ignore the knot in my stomach. The trail grew narrower, winding through thicker trees. The shadows stretched longer, and I knew I had to start thinking about where to camp. I planned to stop near the tower, which the map said was about a mile further. My legs ached, but I pressed forward. When I finally saw the fire tower, I felt both relief and dread. It rose out of the trees like a skeleton, its metal frame rusted and creaking in the wind. The cabin at the top was boarded, but the stairs were still intact. I walked closer, studying it. That was when I saw the boot prints again. They circled the base of the tower, messy and overlapping, as if someone had been pacing. My chest tightened. I looked around, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. No one. I didn't want to camp right next to the tower, so I found a flat spot about 200 yards away. I set up my tent quickly, my hands shaking more than usual. I cooked a small meal, but my stomach didn't want it. I kept thinking about those prints. I told myself they could have been from days earlier, maybe even weeks, though deep down I knew that wasn't true. As night fell, the forest grew darker than I expected. The moon was thin, and clouds covered most of the sky. I sat inside my tent, listening. Every twig snap outside made my pulse race. I tried to tell myself it was deer or raccoons, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone else was near. I barely slept that night. Every time I dozed off, I woke with the thought that someone was standing just outside the thin nylon walls of my tent. When morning finally came, I felt drained. My first thought was to pack up and head back early, but I had planned this hike for weeks, and the stubborn part of me wanted to finish it. I left my tent standing and walked to the tower. The air was cold, and my breath fogged as I climbed the stairs. The metal groaned under my weight. When I reached the top, I peeked into the cabin. The boards had gaps, and through them, I saw scraps of trash inside. An old blanket, food wrappers, and what looked like a rusty tin can. Someone had been staying there. My stomach dropped. The trash didn't look old enough to have been there long. I scanned the woods below, feeling exposed at that height. Everything looked still, but that didn't calm me. I climbed down fast, almost tripping on the last few steps. Back at my tent, I stuffed everything into my pack. I didn't care about breakfast. I just wanted out. The hike back started slow because I kept looking over my shoulder. Every sound made me turn. Around mile 10, I found more prints. They weren't ahead of me this time. They were behind me, over mine from yesterday. That broke something in me. I started walking faster, nearly jogging at times. My pack bounced against me, but I didn't stop. My throat was dry, my lungs burned, but I wanted out of those woods. I couldn't stop imagining someone trailing me, keeping just out of sight. Every time the trail curved, I half expected to see a figure waiting for me. By the time I reached the ridge again, the wind had picked up. I could barely hear my own footsteps over the gusts. I tried to focus on putting one boot in front of the other. Halfway across the ridge, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. At the far end of the trail, where the ridge dipped back into the trees, there was a shape. It was a man standing still, watching me. I froze. He didn't move. He just stood there, too far to see clearly, but close enough that I knew he was real. My mind raced. If I turned back, I would head deeper into the woods. If I went forward, I had to walk straight toward him. The trail was too narrow to go around. I stood there for what felt like forever. Then the figure stepped sideways into the trees and disappeared. That was worse than if he had stayed in sight. Now I didn't know where he was. My legs trembled, but I forced myself forward. Every step across that ridge felt like walking into a trap. My eyes scanned the trees on both sides, searching for movement. Nothing. When I reached the spot where he had been standing, the ground was disturbed. Fresh prints, the same tread as before. I didn't stop to look closer. I kept moving, my pace faster than ever. My legs screamed from the effort, but I didn't care. I just wanted the parking lot. I wanted my car, the locked doors, the engine, the road. The last mile felt endless. The woods grew quieter, almost too quiet, like the world was holding its breath. My pack dug into my shoulders, but I couldn't stop. When I finally saw the glint of metal from my car through the trees, my chest nearly collapsed with relief. I broke into a run. The parking lot was empty just like before. I yanked open my car door, threw my pack inside, and locked the doors the second I sat down. My hands shook as I started the engine. As I pulled out, I glanced at the logbook by the trailhead. Something made me stop. I got out, hurried over, and opened it. There was a new name signed in, dated that morning. No time, no details. Just a name scrawled in large, messy letters. The pen ink was still fresh. I stared at it, my stomach twisting. Whoever it was, they had been out there with me. Maybe they still were. Maybe they had planned to follow me out. I didn't wait to think longer. I got back in my car and drove until the forest was miles behind me. I never went back to that trail. I never found out who left those prints or who signed that book. but I still think about it. I think about the man on the ridge, the pacing at the tower, the prints over mine. And I think about how easily I could have been the person who never made it back to sign anything at all. I never thought much about hiking alone. I had done it many times before, and most of the time it felt calming. I liked being away from traffic, houses, and noise. The trail I chose this time was one I had only read about online. It was listed as moderate, not too long, and not very far from where I lived. The problem was I underestimated how isolated it was. There were warnings about poor cell service and about people getting turned around if they went off the marked trail. At the time, I didn't take those warnings seriously. I left home early in the morning with a backpack that had the usual things: 2 bottles of water, a pack of trail mix, a flashlight, a pocket knife, a light jacket, and my phone. I thought it would be more than enough for a simple day hike. I wasn't planning on staying overnight, so I didn't pack much else. The drive to the trailhead was about an hour and a half, through twisting roads that got narrower as I went deeper into the forest. When I finally reached the dirt lot where the trail started, there were only 2 other cars there. The first stretch of the trail was simple: a wide dirt path with tall trees on both sides. The air smelled of pine, and the morning sun cut through the branches in streaks. The forest felt alive, but not in a bad way. It felt clean and quiet. I walked steadily, trying not to rush. The ground was slightly damp from rain the day before, and I could hear the crunch of my boots with every step. Birds darted between trees, and I could hear woodpeckers in the distance. About 2 hours in, I came to a fork. The map I had printed showed only one main loop, so I wasn't sure why there was a split. The left side looked more worn, like more people had taken it. The right side was narrow, with grass starting to cover parts of it. I thought maybe the right side was just a shortcut or side trail, but curiosity got the better of me. I took it, thinking it would meet back up with the main trail. The deeper I went, the less the ground looked like a trail. Branches stuck out, and the slope became uneven. At one point, I had to push through brush that scratched at my arms. I kept going because I thought it would reconnect soon. I told myself I'd turn back if it didn't. After maybe 30 minutes, I realized I had lost the sense of direction. When I turned around, the path behind me looked almost the same as the path ahead. I tried checking my phone, but as expected, there was no signal. The GPS map that I had downloaded before leaving only showed a blank screen with a little blue dot frozen in place. That was the moment I felt the first bit of unease. I wasn't in real danger yet, but I knew I had made a mistake. I decided to backtrack, following the way I thought I had come. At first, it seemed fine, but then the ground didn't look the same anymore. The tree patterns weren't matching what I remembered. I told myself to stay calm, so I stopped, looked around, and tried to notice landmarks. That was when I realized almost every direction looked identical. Tall pines, patches of thick brush, and uneven dirt. The forest had a way of repeating itself. I kept walking, certain that I would eventually find the main trail again. But every turn led to more forest. Hours passed. The sun was higher in the sky now, and I started sweating. I sat on a fallen log to drink water and eat some trail mix. I kept telling myself I wasn't lost, that I was just taking the long way back. Still, deep down, I knew I had gone off trail completely. By the time afternoon came, I had been walking for 5 hours straight. My legs ached, and my shirt stuck to my back. I heard sounds now that made me uneasy. Branches snapping, not far behind me, but every time I turned, there was nothing. Probably animals, I thought. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I tried marking trees with my knife so I wouldn't go in circles. I carved little slashes into the bark as I walked. After another hour, I passed one of the same trees I had already marked. That crushed my confidence. I had been looping without realizing it. I stopped again, sat on the ground, and tried to steady my breathing. I only had 1 bottle of water left, and it wasn't even evening yet. That was when the real fear started to sink in. Not the kind you feel from hearing a noise at night, but the kind that grows in your chest when you realize you are actually in trouble. I stood up and decided to pick one direction and stick with it no matter what. I walked straight, ignoring side paths and ignoring how tired I was. I walked until the sun started dipping lower, turning the forest darker. The air cooled, and the woods grew quiet. Too quiet. When night finally fell, I used my flashlight. The beam felt small against the massive dark around me. Every sound was amplified. The rustle of leaves, the distant cry of something in the woods, my own footsteps. I tried to find a place to rest. I didn't have a tent, only my jacket. I found a spot under a thick tree where the ground was dry. I sat with my back against the trunk, clutching the flashlight like it was the only thing keeping me safe. That night felt endless. I didn't sleep, not really. I dozed in short bursts, waking every time I thought I heard movement nearby. My throat was dry, and I rationed my water carefully. By the time the sky started to brighten again, I felt weak. The second day was worse. My legs were heavy, and my mouth was parched. I tried to conserve energy, moving slower, but the fear of being stuck drove me forward. I searched for streams or any sign of water. Finally, in the late afternoon, I heard trickling. I followed the sound until I found a small creek cutting through the forest. Relief hit me so hard I almost cried. I filled my bottle and drank. The water was cold, metallic tasting, but it was life. I stayed there for a long time, resting, washing my face, and trying to plan my next move. The creek gave me hope. If I followed it, maybe it would lead to a road or a larger body of water where people might be. I decided to stick with the creek. The ground alongside it was uneven, full of rocks and roots, but at least it was a direction. For hours, I pushed forward. Sometimes the creek narrowed, sometimes it widened. At one point, I found animal tracks in the mud, deer maybe. That reminded me I wasn't alone out there. When night came again, I stayed near the creek. The sound of water was comforting, but it also masked other noises. I kept imagining something stepping through the woods behind me, hidden by the constant trickle. Again, I barely slept. The third day broke me. My food was gone and I was weak. I moved slower, tripping often. At one point, I slipped on wet rocks and fell hard, scraping my knee. Blood soaked into my pants, and the pain shot through my leg with every step. But I kept going because there was no other choice. Late in the day, I noticed something new, a faint shape in the distance through the trees. At first, I thought it was just rocks, but as I limped closer, I saw it was a wooden post, a trail marker. Faded paint clung to it, and the wood was cracked, but it was a marker. Hope surged again. I followed where it pointed, through more brush, until I stumbled onto a narrow dirt trail. Not the same one I had started on, but it was a trail. Trails meant people. I followed it for hours, even as the sun set again. My flashlight flickered, the battery dying, but I didn't stop. Around midnight, I saw something ahead, reflective metal glinting. A sign. I pushed myself forward until I stood in front of it. It was an old trailhead sign, half broken, but behind it was a gravel road. I collapsed to my knees on that road. I didn't even care where it led. I followed it until my legs could barely carry me, and just before dawn, I saw headlights in the distance. A pickup truck slowed as it came near, and I waved weakly, stumbling into the middle of the road. The driver stopped, got out, and helped me into the truck bed. I was too exhausted to even speak. All I could feel was relief. It took 3 days of being lost, dehydrated, and starving, but I had made it out. I learned how quickly things could turn bad, how small mistakes added up. I learned respect for the forest, and I learned that being unprepared can almost cost you your life. That experience has never left me. To this day, when I think about hiking, I pack more than I need, I mark every turn, and I never let curiosity take me off the trail again. Because I know what it feels like to be swallowed by the woods, to hear nothing but your own ragged breathing, and to wonder if you'll ever see another road again. And I never want to feel that again.